There is one page in A Song of Ice and Fire that sticks out more than any other in that it contains just so many problems. And this problematic page appears shockingly early. In A Game of Thrones, page 25 in my copy, we have the third page of the first Daenerys chapter. And, well, it's a doozy. You have all likely heard of Lemongate at this point. And if you haven't, I don't know where you've been. I honestly talk about it all the friggin' time. But Lemongate is only the tip of the iceberg of this puzzling page. This page of lies. Now, this page being filled with contradictions and misinformation shows that there is something seriously wrong with Daenerys' memory, and perhaps Dany is not really Daenerys Targaryen. And when I say that, I mean Dany might not be the daughter of Aerys and Rhaella Targaryen. And people should really check out the classic essay by Mark G. 171 called Fake Dany, which I've linked below and which much of this video covers. Now, let's examine Dany's page of lies more closely and see just how bad things are. As many of you may remember, Daenerys' first chapter begins with Viserys coming to Daenerys with a gown and some threats before he leaves Dany briefly with her thoughts. And it's here that we're first introduced to Dany's memory. Ours by blood right, taken from us by treachery, but ours still, ours forever. You do not steal from the dragon, oh no. The dragon remembers. And perhaps the dragon did remember, but Dany could not. She had never seen this land her brother said was theirs, this realm beyond the narrow sea, these places he talked of, Casterly Rock and the Eyrie, Highgarden and the Vale of Arryn, Dorne and the Isle of Faces. They were just words to her. Viserys had been a boy of 8 when they fled King's Landing to escape the advancing armies of the usurper, but Daenerys had only been a quickening in her mother's womb. Yet sometimes Dany would picture the way it had been. So often had her brother told her the stories. So this is significant. Our preamble to Dany's backstory is a disclaimer. Dany doesn't remember it, and the source on her life are 14-year-old childhood memories from a cruel, half-insane man. And so it's actually not surprising that after this disclaimer, everything begins to break down. The midnight flight to Dragonstone, moonlight shimmering on the ship's black sails, her brother Rhaegar battling the usurper in the bloody waters of the Trident and dying for the woman he loved. The sack of King's Landing by the ones Viserys called the usurper's dogs, the lords Lannister and Stark. Princess Elia of Dorne pleading for mercy as Rhaegar's heir was ripped from her breast and murdered before her eyes. The polished skulls of the last dragons staring down sightlessly from the walls of the throne room while the Kingslayer opened father's throat with a golden sword. Now, this list of stories is curious. Each of the latter stories are fleshed out as the novels progress. The Trident, the Sack, the murder of Elia and Aegon, the Dragon Skulls, Jaime killing Aerys. Each of those stories is extremely nuanced and complicated, with new revealed information changing the way we view the event. But what of the first story, the midnight flight to Dragonstone? We know little of that. Is there more to that tale? Well, the flight to Dragonstone is exceedingly odd, as we actually get a first-hand description of this event from Jaime in A Feast for Crows. Jaime had only seen Rhaella once after that, the morning of the day she left for Dragonstone. The queen had been cloaked and hooded as she climbed inside the royal wheelhouse that would take her down Aegon's high hill to the waiting ship, but he heard her maids whispering after she was gone. Now, although Viserys isn't mentioned in Jaime's scene, it's generally assumed that Viserys and Rhaella traveled together. Jaime speaks of them being packed off to Dragonstone together in a storm of swords, and Daenerys' tale from Viserys speaks of their collective flight, as in him and her in utero. So Viserys and Rhaella did have a flight to Dragonstone in the morning, a contradiction to what Daenerys has been told. It was not at midnight, and there was no moonlight shining on black smuggler-like sails. Black sails, by the way, would be completely pointless if they left in the morning. And the trip doesn't sound so much like an unannounced flight as an ordered, scheduled trip with the royal wheelhouse heading down to the ship. It's an odd contradiction to say the least. Our author had written that the trip happened at midnight, and then later, with Jaime's retelling in A Feast for Crows, changed the time and circumstance to the morning. Now, one could perhaps argue that the discrepancy is Viserys' fault. he was trying to make the trip seem exciting and for some reason wanted to impress Dany, or perhaps Viserys and Rhaella were actually on different ships at different times, or perhaps he conflated his flight to Dragonstone with his flight from Dragonstone. Nonetheless, we find that the very first line on Dany's backstory is off, and Viserys' stories are not to be trusted, at least not wholesale. But let's continue. She had been born on Dragonstone 9 moons after their flight, while a raging summer storm threatened to rip the island fastness apart. They said that storm was terrible. Now, on first read, this story sounds innocent enough. Women get pregnant all the time and have children all the time, and storms happen all of the time. But later on, we find out how unlikely this event actually is. In the world of Ice and Fire, we find out that Rhaella and Aerys famously had trouble having children. After the birth of Rhaegar, Rhaella had 2 miscarriages, a stillbirth, a child who survived 6 months, another stillbirth, another miscarriage, a preemie who died fairly quickly, then Viserys, and then had no children for 8 years. All in all, that's 25 years of trying, with only 2 children to show for it. And then, the very last time the two ever have sex, after years and years of trouble, when Rhaella is pushing 40, Rhaella happens to get pregnant and delivers a healthy child. It's all exceedingly unlikely and a rather contrived tale. When House Targaryen is near extinction, we get this improbable 11th hour Targaryen birth, when there's already another 11th hour Targaryen birth to save the house on top of an 11th hour Targaryen baby swap to save the house. An improbable contrivance among other contrivances. And then there's the storm, a raging, terrible storm. And in A Storm of Swords, Dany actually amends this information to say that it wasn't just any storm, but the greatest storm in the memory of Westeros. Now, we aren't sure what the memory of Westeros means. The greatest storm in 12,000 years of Westerosi history? Or is it simply the greatest storm in the living memory of Westerosi, as in the greatest storm in 100 years? Either way, we're talking about a huge storm, something the size of a hurricane. Although we should keep in mind that other than Daenerys' nickname, Stormborn, no one else mentions any famous storm in our story, and certainly not the greatest storm in a century. And it's even odder when we think of the timing. Dany was born in summer, and according to Cotter Pike, a sailor who lives on the Narrow Sea, storms are most common in the autumn and are fiercest in the winter. And yet somehow, the greatest storm in at least a century, something that is as powerful as a hurricane, hits in the wrong season to usher in an unlikely pregnancy and is promptly never mentioned again by anyone except for Daenerys. The Targaryen fleet was smashed while it lay at anchor, and huge stone blocks were ripped from the parapets and sent hurtling into the wild waters of the Narrow Sea. Her mother had died birthing her, and for that, her brother Viserys had never forgiven her. So next we hear about 2 curious casualties of the storm, the Targaryen fleet and pieces of the Dragonstone fastness itself. First, the Targaryen fleet. So we have an enormous hurricane-like storm that wipes out the Targaryen fleet. That by itself is not surprising. I mean, the storm is surprising, but not the destruction of the fleet. That's fairly reasonable. What's curious is that the Targaryen fleet is not the only fleet in the area. Also on Blackwater Bay, we have King's Landing, a few hundred miles from Dragonstone, and it's there that Stannis is actively building his fleet to take Dragonstone. And yet Stannis' fleet is untouched by this once-in-a-century storm. We hear nothing of any storm or any problems from Stannis, and he later uses this new fleet to take Dragonstone. One would think that somehow preserving this fleet in the middle of a hurricane would be on Stannis' list of achievements, but it fails to be mentioned. He brags about leading an assault on Dragonstone, and Davos notes the importance of this assault, which by itself is odd as the Targaryen fleet was destroyed, so it's not much of an achievement, but Stannis never talks up any storm. And then there's the supposed damage to Dragonstone. Daenerys claims huge blocks were ripped from the parapets. And this is extremely odd as we actually get a very detailed description of what Dragonstone looks like from both Crescent and Davos. And quite strikingly, Dragonstone is made from fused Valyrian stone, a method of engineering that is lost to Westerosi, So, one, there are no blocks. It's continuous stone, I imagine like cement. But two, even if there were blocks and damage did happen, the method of engineering is lost, so there'd be no way to repair Dragonstone. And yet, we never hear of any damage from Crescent and Davos. Not once. In fact, Crescent and Davos spend a great deal of time talking about the lifelike aspects of the gargoyles and dragon-shaped structures of Dragonstone. They're ready to come alive. But never once do they talk about missing pieces that would completely ruin the lifelike appearance. So on top of there being no testimonial evidence of a storm, we have no physical evidence of a storm either. In fact, we have no evidence that Dany was actually born on Dragonstone. Yes, Sorella Sand mentions it, but no one alive was actually there. And very weirdly, in the A Clash of Kings prologue, Stannis speaks of Viserys and the babe escaping him on Dragonstone without the identity of the baby given. She did not remember Dragonstone either. They had run again, just before the usurper's brother set sail with his new-built fleet. By then, only Dragonstone itself, the ancient seat of the house, had remained of the Seven Kingdoms that had once been theirs. It would not remain long. The garrison had prepared to sell them to the usurper, but one night, Sir Willem Darry and 4 loyal men had broken into the nursery and stolen them both, along with her wet nurse, and set sail under cover of darkness for the safety of the Bravosian coast. So here, after another reminder that Dany doesn't remember any of this, we are told that Viserys and Dany left Dragonstone prior to Stannis' arrival. And we have a situation that makes absolutely no sense. First off, we're told specifically that the Targaryen fleet is destroyed, and now we find out that the garrison of the castle is ready to surrender and give up Viserys and Dany. So, according to Dany's story, there's absolutely no resistance to the Baratheons on Dragonstone. Not a fleet, not a castle garrison. And this completely contradicts both Stannis and Davos' accounts. Keep in mind, when Davos tries to talk up Stannis to Godric Borrell in A Dance with Dragons, he presents the following resume. Stannis held Storm's End against the Tyrells and the Redwynes. He took Dragonstone from the last Targaryens. He smashed the Iron Fleet off Fair Isle. This Child King will not prevail against him. So, we have a brutal, year-long siege where Stannis nearly starved, as well as a decisive naval victory against Iron Men, the best sailors in Westeros. These are 2 very impressive feats. And then there's the taking of Dragonstone, which, according to Dany, had no fleet and had a garrison ready to surrender. And later, in the Winds of Winter, Stannis says this to Theon. I defeated your uncle Victarion and his iron fleet off Fair Isle, the first time your father crowned himself. I held Storm's End against the power of the Reach for a year, and took Dragonstone from the Targaryens. I smashed Mance Rayder at the Wall, though he had 20 times my numbers. Tell me, Turncloak, what battles has the bastard of Bolton ever won that I should fear him? So again, we have Storm's End, Fair Isle, and now a victory against 100,000 wildlings. And there's Dragonstone, supposedly against no fleet and a surrendering garrison. Now, it's important to note that both Davos and Stannis, along with claiming that this feat was impressive, claim that the island was taken, meaning it wasn't given, no one surrendered beforehand. And this isn't just Davos and Stannis exaggerating to impress their audiences. Davos' internal monologue in A Clash of Kings specifically describes the taking of Dragonstone as an assault. And Davos was there. There was in fact combat. Combat in which Stannis plays a commanding role equivalent to Imry Florent at the Battle of the Blackwater. Combat that they claim is as impressive as the Siege of Storm's End, the battle at Fair Isle, and the battle at the Wall. So unless the castle garrison illogically changed their minds and then decided to pointlessly fight Stannis after Viserys and Dany had left, we have a massive hole in the story. Now, there being a battle at Dragonstone when there shouldn't have been a battle isn't the only thing off about this situation. The escape is also filled with oddities. For example, it's a little weird that Willem Darry breaks into the nursery to find Viserys there with Dany. Jaime and Cersei were not normally allowed into Tyrion's nursery, and Rhaella was not found in Aegon's nursery during the sack of King's Landing. So why would Viserys be holed up in Dany's nursery? But a much more vexing question is what became of the 4 loyal men and the wet nurse? They are never spoken of again. And how on earth did Viserys and Dany sail away from Dragonstone when we were just told that all the ships were destroyed? Now, one might claim that perhaps I'm overthinking this, and perhaps our author didn't consider these issues or felt them unimportant. But we know this not to be the case. As it happens, the supposed escape of Viserys and Dany returns to our story in a way when it's later heavily paralleled with the story of Edric's Storm. Back in A Storm of Swords, Davos and a group of Kingsmen conspire to whisk away Edric's Storm from Dragonstone before he is potentially sacrificed by Melisandre. They get out of Postern Gate to one of Salladhor Sand's ships, where Edric is sent off to Weiss. And the parallels between these 2 escapes is clear, too close to be a coincidence. An escape from Dragonstone, a potential sacrifice of royal children, a late-night rescue by the most loyal, safety across the narrow sea in Essos, and perhaps most striking, like Viserys and Dany, Edric is put under the care of a knightly guardian, Andrew Estermont in the place of Willem Darry, with Sir Tristan, Sir Gerald, Lewis the Fishwife, and Omar Blackberry being the 4 loyal men. Now, this taking of Edric's Storm does illuminate how Willem Darry could have realistically pulled off his heist of Targaryen children from Dragonstone. However, the parallel tale also heavily highlights the loyal men and the ship, with each man and even the ship named and their status being updated in the appendices of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. And so it's rather striking that so much time and detail has been given to the Dragonstone flight of Edric's Storm, yet is lacking from the Dragonstone flight of Viserys and Dany. We know that our author remembers these details and cares about these details enough to create a parallel story, and yet we have been given absolutely no information on Viserys' 4 loyal men or his ship. And then on top of this, Willem Darry, with his mysterious crew and his mysterious ship, decides to head to the safety of Braavos, a city founded by people trying to escape Valyrians instead of the much closer city of Pentos. But we will speak more of Willem Darry, Braavos, and life at the House with the Red Door as we continue on with the Page of Lies in Part 2. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.